Hi, friends. Eric from Hit Subscribe here, and I am coming to you again at long last from my home office here in rural Michigan, which is kind of a mess. Let's hope I get this cleaned up and have a nicer background in the coming weeks. I've got like a mini floppy guy that my wife got me back there, so I kind of want to get that going in the background, even though it'll be super distracting, and everybody that makes video will tell me that's a horrible thing to do, but I'm going with it. So anyway, uh, good to be back home and in a slightly different recording setup with better lighting and a different angle. But let's roll on with this series, which is Freelancer Q&A. This week I have a fairly straightforward, albeit slightly depressing question. How do you keep the faith when you're struggling to find work? The phrasing there is kind of interesting. Like if I maybe if I were like a proper YouTuber, when I go syndicate this over to YouTube, I would try to find like a small clip of Billy Joel singing "Keeping the Faith." Although tonally, I think that would be really inappropriate. I'm sorry, question asker. Was from a few years ago, still in my backlog. So I'm hoping you've kept the faith and found work and that all is good now. So anyway, I don't mean to make light of the situation. I just kind of enjoyed the turn of phrase. So anyway, let me dive into that and address it. And actually, speaking of keeping the faith, I guess maybe the first thing that I would say is I would remove that way of thinking about it from your mind. I mean, granted, that might just have been how you chose to phrase it, but I don't really like thinking of it as faith. Without getting into the definitional weeds of that term, that sort of implies that you're waiting for the universe or some higher power or something to bring you work. And if that's what you're doing, it's kind of an analog to whoever originally said hope is not a strategy. So, I'm not trying to be pedantic here. I would definitely recommend that you alter your way of thinking from hopefully good things will happen to me to how do I go out and create a situation where good things will happen, or how do I make good things happen. So with that in mind, let's kind of walk through how to approach this. So I'm going to talk about ways to potentially win business, short or medium term. But before I do that, I want to say something here that I think is significant. So if you have decided to go independent at some point, and you're, potentially out of runway, I would certainly recommend when you go independent having some runway. Assume it's going to be hard to find business for a while. But if you've kind of exhausted your runway or getting close to it, you need to have some thought. You need to probably sit down and do an exercise and try to be as dispassionate as you can to evaluate when might it be time to pull the plug. So if you've been getting dribs and drabs of business through Upwork or something and it's really not going very well, there is a time where you should say, okay, I need to rethink this fundamentally. I need to maybe quit what I'm doing here. And if you're watching this and you're thinking of going off on your own, or you've just gone off on your own and you still have runway, or if you've gone off on your own and you've turned your employer into your first client, like if you're in less dire circumstances than I presume the question asker was, that's a much better time to make a predetermined decision about when you would bail out of venture off on your own. And this can probably apply to like venture-backed startup founders, although there's going to be other concerns there, but like bootstrap business founders, even if you're doing something as a side hustle, you should say, I'm going to try this new thing. And when you're setting out, you should then, at that moment, when you're not invested, in the same way that you would be in the moment when you're not in the trenches, you could say, all right, what is a failure criteria here? What does it look like when I know this isn't working? So let's say that you have 6 months of living expenses in the bank. You might say something like, if I haven't gotten to replacement income with my freelance practice for my salaried employment within 9 months, then I need to have this this conversation with myself or whatever, this evaluation of maybe I should bail out. So I don't want to belabor the point here, but you should set up some checkpoints where you give yourself permission not to feel like a quitter, where you're just making a rational business decision So at the time when you're looking out and things are rosy, if this hasn't happened by this date, then I give myself permission to consider that maybe I should do something different. Maybe I should go back and get another job, or whatever the case may be. And the reason I'm saying this is because it's going to be way easier for you to do that if you, in better times, were forward looking and thinking about it, than if you're in the middle of it. You've tied your identity to your new freelance practice, and you will inevitably feel like a quitter for entertaining those feelings. You won't feel like a quitter if you set up exit or fail criteria at the beginning. I mean, maybe you will, but not quite in the same way. You're executing a rational plan. Now, the other thing I want to say here is, and this isn't just a pep talk, I've seen this play out. There are people who kind of ping pong between being free agents, independent consultants, or freelancers, whatever, and being salaried employed folks. So I don't want to convey this narrative that you take a job for a while and then you go off on your own as a freelancer. That's your new career. And if you ever go back to salaried work, you have failed. It's not the case. There are a lot of people that like to have a foot in both arenas. The way I would look at it, to maybe fix this in your head if you're struggling, think of salaried employment, if you go and take a look at that again, as creating a situation where you have one whale client that's very stable compared to the average client situation. So in a sense, you could look at this as you're just making a business decision, like your book of business is almost empty. You go land one whale client, and maybe you approach employment where you're saying, okay, I'm going to do this for 1, 2, 3 years. I'm going to stack my chips, build my runway back up, and then come back at freelancing with fresh perspective, maybe some new concepts, maybe some new ideas for productized services or whatever. But I'm going to replenish my coffers, rebuild my runway, and then try again with the lessons that I've learned now. And I don't see anything wrong with this, frankly. As somebody who it's been 10 years. Wow. Yeah. 10 years since I had a boss that wasn't me, almost exactly to the date. I think this was about the last time, 10 years ago is about when I left my salaried job. Anyway, but as somebody in that position, there have been a lot of times where I'm dealing with the Department of Labor of Iowa, or whatever you deal with as a business owner, where I'm like, why on earth did I sign up for this? What I could go do is I could probably get a job as an executive somewhere for a pretty nice salary. And so many of these things I'm worrying about right now would not be my problem. And wow, doesn't that sound nice? So even people, if you think of me as an example of somebody who's, gone into a free agent world and stayed there, even people who have never ping ponged, sometimes it's not so clear cut whether you've made the right decision or not. So all of this is to say there is nothing wrong with going back and taking salaried employment if that's what you're worried about, keeping the faith when you're having trouble finding business. Give yourself permission to view taking on a salaried position, if that's an option, as being a perfectly viable thing to do. Okay, so with that in mind, let's assume that you're not going to do that, at least for now, and you're just really looking for advice on how to drum up business. Now, I don't remember enough context here to know for how long the person asking this question had been on their own, if it was went off on their own and struggling out of the gate, or after a bunch of years, I'm not sure. So I'm going to kind of tick off things that people may or may not have executed as freelancers, but here in kind of order of maybe likelihood is what I might do. So first of all, if you have never approached your friends and family explaining what you do, that's a great place to start. Now, the caveat that I'll offer here is if you're doing freelance, Python development or something, your, uncle who runs a landscaping business or whatever probably isn't going to understand a lot about what that means. So you want to go to your friends and family in a way that makes it as clear as possible who you help and what you help them do. So in that example with your uncle and Python landscaping, you might talk to him about people that need web development, and you might want to be clear about what kind of businesses would have enough money to pay you or what have you. So I don't want to get into the weeds of specifics here, but you can't go to your uncle who runs the landscaping business and say I do Python and pandas and Django and that's not going to mean anything to most of your friends and family. You need to do a little bit of legwork up front to figure out how to equip them as easily as possible to make introductions to people that might be in a position to hire you. So, think about bending over backwards to explain what you could possibly offer to your uncle so that it will trigger a moment where he says, oh yeah, I know whoever that needs this. I have this competitor that's at a much larger company, and he was talking about needing, help overhauling a website or something. I don't know. But, think that through. So go to your friends and family, but with a very clear message that makes it dead simple for them to make introductions to you or to hire you if applicable. But it's not going to be probably super common that your friends and family by and large are in a position to hire you. So go to them first. And those are the people that most want you to succeed in your practice. So if you make it even remotely clear to them what it is you do, they will help you. They'll want to help you. So explain things to them in a way where they could probably repeat what you told them back to someone else at a party and encourage that person that they've met at a party to give you a call. That's how clear it should be, that they can repeat it to somebody else. Next up, put the word out to your network. That's another kind of no-brainer too. Now, I think it's just generally good advice to crisp up your potential value proposition as much as humanly possible for everyone. It'll be a little bit less important when we're talking about your professional network. So your professional network is going to be former bosses, former colleagues, former I guess like immediate colleagues, but also more extended colleagues. So if you were working in a product environment doing software engineering and you just happen to, know somebody that was in sales, that person's on the table too. So get the word out to everybody in your network as much as you can. Again, crisp up your value proposition, make it as clear as possible what sort of work you're looking for so that they understand how to, make connections as well. But it will be easier for those people to make connections because they'll understand your professional context better. Now, that being said, they're not going to be rooting for you on average quite as hard as your friends and family. So you might want to do a little bit more legwork for introductions. And here's another thing that you can do, actually piggybacking on the network concept instead of just saying like, hey, I do Python and I'm struggling. Can you help me out? Try to make it as clear as possible. Number one, your value proposition, but number two, who you might want an introduction to. So for a given person in your network, you might go onto LinkedIn and start to look at their connections and brainstorm a list of people that you think might be interested in your services. And then instead of going to, Susie in your network and saying, hey, Susie, I'm looking for Python work, you could say, hey, Susie, I am looking for Python work on the web side for companies that are playing in the data space. And it looks to me like, person A, B, C, D in your network might be interested. Would you be willing to make introductions to any of those people? That's a much more likely way to succeed, or at least to get productive sales or networking calls on the calendar. So the theme that's emerging here as you go to your friends and family and then to your network, do as much of their homework for them as possible. So you're not asking them to do work to figure out how you get paid. You should put in that legwork for them, and that will make them much more likely to help you and much more able to make connections for the sake of helping you. Another thing that I'll offer here, this is going to be hard to swallow, especially if you've been sort of struggling to pay the mortgage, but offer really steep discounts or, potentially even do things for free to get a couple of engagements on the books, to get a couple of reps of doing something. This is an extremely short-term thing, but if one of the reasons that you perceive you might be struggling to land business, especially out of the gate, is that you don't have any experience doing it, you don't have anything you can put up on your website or list in a PDF brochure or something that you distribute, you don't have any case studies of anybody working with you, go get those case studies. I have done this a lot throughout my career, usually because if I'm talking to somebody and I think I might be able to help them, but I'm not really clear on how or how to price it, I really hate doing things by the hour. So a lot of times I will just say like, well, okay, let me spend some time with you. I'm going to dig into this and see if I can figure out how I might even be useful. That type of mentality can be very helpful because it will get you aligned with these folks problem solving and potentially create situations where you actually figure something out. And then you come and say like, look, I've never done this before. I don't know how to price it. So I'm going to give you a really cheap rate. I'm not going to give this to other people once I've kind of retrospected on this and figured out how much time I spent, what my costs were, et cetera. But, for now, I just want to get this in the books. We'll even do this to this day with Hit Subscribe and, people other than me involved. If you ask people on the staff at Hit Subscribe, I will serially like underprice new things if we've never done them before, so that we can then regroup, figure out what our costs were, put a margin on top of it and say, okay, now I can justify this price because I understand the cost because we've done it before and so on. So that's not a fun one, but it can be a good way to get in. You could think of it as, especially if you're doing something that's a relatively short or small scoped engagement, you're almost creating like a mini version of what like Amazon or Uber or other enshittification platforms do, where they start out with pricing that absolutely undercuts all of the competition and is a no-brainer. And then they win that business and then they, go on to do horrendous things. That's not really what I'm recommending that you do, though. It's more like, if there's an initial, like, you could get, actually this came up recently with somebody that was looking for like web development. Nobody wants to touch anything on the web development side for, less than a K or something. But if you were to go in and say like, look, I can fix a little bit of CSS for you here for $50, then you get them on the book as a client and they'll probably keep coming back to you with more work. And it can be a little tricky if you've come in really cheap to negotiate up, but you can sort of lay the groundwork for that, where you say, look, I'm going to do this as an introductory offering here to get your business and to get a feel for the lay of the land here. But I'm telling you right now that with future business, I will reserve the right to adjust pricing upwards. That can be a good way to lay the groundwork there. You'll still get pushback. They'll still want the cheaper pricing. But if you've approached it that way up front, it can be an easier sell versus if you're like, yeah, I'll do this for $15 an hour and you don't say anything more. Then when you come back and say, all right, now I want $45 or $90 an hour, they're going to balk at that if you haven't teed that up in advance. But offering steep discounts can be a way to get a foot in the door. One last thing I'll mention here, kind of building on what I was just saying, is even though if you set expectations about raising your rates later, that can still be a tough sell. So if you're going to offer steep discounts to win business, go into that with the mindset of you're going to create case studies and testimonials and use the experience to win future other business. Meaning, if you're doing these steep discounts, don't bank on then finagling that client up market and using them as a long-term anchor client. Go in with the mindset that you're going to do steep discounts to win business so that you can use that as future sales to different clients. And if you go in with that assumption, your life will probably be better as you do more selling. The final thing that I will offer is probably the best tactic and one of my favorites, though it can be sort of hard to execute. I've been doing this for years. I have a lot of experience consulting and doing this type of thing. I'm talking about what I call, I didn't coin this. I've heard Jonathan Stark use this term and Rochelle Moulton when they had that podcast and other people, but it's called a listening tour. And this is really just another term for market research. So this could be your friends and family, it could be your network, or it could be a form of cold outreach. But the way I like to do this is you are essentially going to disqualify whoever you reach out to as immediate business. But what you're doing is you're saying, hey, I'm thinking of offering X. Like I'm thinking of offering this productized service of Python and web development where I did that. But I don't have this baked yet. So I couldn't sell this to you if I wanted to. I just want to get your opinion. You seem like you would be somebody who might consume a service like this. You seem like an expert. You seem like somebody whose opinion would be good to have. So is it all right if we do a call? I'm going to present to you what I'm thinking. Maybe you can poke some holes in it or give me some pointers. You would be surprised at how easy it is to get on people's calendar with a pitch like that versus like, I want to try to sell you my services. If you position it as market research, as this listening tour, you'll find that you'll get a lot of calls. Now, unless you're kind of a scumbag, you should honor your original proposition. Do not under any circumstances bait and switch and start trying to pitch them on stuff. First of all, that's crappy to do, and it won't be long before the word gets out that you're like that. Secondly, you probably won't need to, because if you get halfway decent at these listening tours and you start to ask them questions, and that should really be what you're doing, you should be asking them about their hopes and dreams and pains and things they're struggling with. You should ask for their opinion about the service you're providing or thinking of providing. You should listen carefully to them as they rip it apart and say they would never buy it, but they would buy this other thing. And there is a decent chance that as you do that sort of joint brainstorming, they will say, you know what, I would pay for it, it's X. And you'll be in a position where you think to yourself, I could do X. That's a thing that could happen. That conversation can be on the table. If it comes up, I would say something like, you know, I actually think I could do that, but I told you I wasn't going to do a sales pitch. Let me go give it some thought. Or, you know, you could, you know, maybe brainstorm ahead of time if that were to come up, a way that you could reframe it a little bit and say, like, I didn't, you know, I think I could maybe do this for you. I don't want to write a proposal because I told you I wasn't going to sell you anything. But, you know, if you wanted it, I could, you know, so brainstorm some way to kind of revisit that fundamental assumption of the conversation, but only if you have a sense that they are talking from a position of not so much just hypothetically what I might pay for, but that they're teasing at the idea of, you know, what I would pay you for is X. So you want to be pretty sensitive about flipping this, but what you're really looking for here is to build your network, to be in a lot of people's minds over the course of time, and to learn from these conversations. So if you hear 2, 3, 4 different people tell you, you know what, I probably would pay for, and it's variants of the same thing, now you can start to think in terms of positioning and starting to sell that. And you could even go back to some of the people you talk to and say, hey, a number of different people have told me the same thing as you, which is that they would be willing to pay for X. I am starting to put together, you know, the beginnings of an offering. If I do that, would you be open to discussing a potential proposal? So you could re-propose to them to get them back on the calendar. And that gives them the opportunity to say, like, hey, you know, I was happy to help you. I don't really want to hear a pitch, because that's really what you want to do. You want to preserve the integrity of the reason that you were reaching out to them in the first place. So, that is, in my opinion, maybe the hardest one to execute for a lot of people with no consulting experience, but I think the most powerful and valuable one. You will learn a lot, and you will often, one thing I see over and over again from indies, that, like, it's so tempting, especially if your only foray into entrepreneurship has been something like an info product. It's so tempting to just, like, run off and say, here's this giant list of, like, stuff that I can do, and I'm going to build this offering, and I'm going to build my mailing list, and blah, blah, like, that doesn't work well. You go to all that effort, and then you know, go and you have a call with somebody, and they're like, nah, that sucks. Like, you would be amazed at how much better it will go for you to figure out what kind of offering you should do, what kind of niche you might find to get into, if you listen to people first instead of coming up with ideas first. So definitely do that if you can. This is getting lengthier than I anticipated. So a couple things that I'll list that I probably wouldn't do in a position like this. I wouldn't start doing a lot of cold outreach, you know, like, who needs Python services? I wouldn't start doing any kind of advertising and getting, you know, further into the red. I wouldn't start responding to RFPs and commodifying yourself. If you feel like those things are the way that what you're going to need to resort to in order to win business, and you're already struggling and have been struggling, and you're not finding business and trying to keep the faith, you're going to burn out, or you're going to become just cataclysmically depressed, because the things that I'm talking about, all this commodified type of stuff, outreach, labor, commodification, advertising, RFPs, all of that stuff has very, very, very low win rates. So if you're already depressed and already struggling to keep the faith, that's just going to make it worse, and you're going to spend money. Don't do those things. If those are the only refuges that you have left in terms of your work right at the moment, do something else, regroup, go take another position, you know, get whole with your finances, start stacking your chips again, build up that runway, and then come back at it when you have more energy. But don't do any of these types of kind of like low signal activities. So yeah, that's my take on I guess keeping the faith. So don't keep the faith, lay out a sort of well-reasoned plan and establish criteria for yourself as to when, like, hey, even with this well-reasoned plan, it doesn't seem to be working. It's time to do something else. So just approach it kind of as coolly and rationally as you possibly can, and understand that there's no shame in shifting away from what you're doing. Don't keep the faith forever, or you will get hopelessly depressed. So yeah, hopefully all of that is at least somewhat helpful, and I will catch you all next time.